This is not how empires fall. There are no declarations of defeat, no surrender ceremonies, no formal transfers of power documented in history books. The mechanisms that determine which nations rise and which nations contract do not announce themselves through dramatic events. They operate through dependencies, through supply chains that lock into place before anyone recognizes their permanence, through resource positions that cannot be replicated regardless of investment or political will. Most analysis of global power focuses on military capability, economic output, technological innovation. These are visible metrics. They generate headlines. They provide clear frameworks for comparison. But they are downstream effects. The foundational variable that determines everything else operates at a level most observers never examine. Control of materials that industrial civilization cannot function without. Canada has achieved a position in critical mineral supply chains that has no historical parallel, not through military conquest, not through diplomatic maneuvering, through geological accident combined with institutional stability that took centuries to develop. The result is leverage that cannot be overcome through conventional responses. This is the resource shift that changed everything. Critical minerals are elements required for technologies that define modern industrial capacity. Lithium for battery production, rare earth elements for advanced electronics, cobalt for energy storage systems, graphite for electrical components, nickel for manufacturing processes. These materials have no substitutes given current technology, and they are concentrated in geological formations that cannot be reproduced. The Canadian Shield represents some of the oldest exposed rock on Earth. Billions of years of tectonic activity and chemical processes created mineral concentrations that exist nowhere else at comparable scale and accessibility. This is not a temporary market advantage that competitors can overcome through better exploration or improved extraction techniques. It is permanent geological reality. When lithium deposits form, they require specific combinations of volcanic activity, water chemistry, and time measured in epochs. You cannot create these conditions. You cannot manufacture alternatives. You either control territory where these formations exist, or you negotiate with whoever does. There is no third option. Canada controls approximately 40% of lithium reserves that meet industrial requirements for battery-grade material. Quebec and Ontario contain deposits sufficient to supply global electric vehicle production for decades. These are not speculative resources. They are proven reserves with existing infrastructure capable of scaling production rapidly. The scale of coming demand makes this concentration decisive. Electric vehicle adoption is accelerating faster than most projections anticipated. Every major automotive manufacturer has committed to electrification timelines that require lithium supply to increase by factors of 10 to 15 within 2 decades. Current global production capacity cannot meet this demand, even if every existing mine operates at maximum output continuously. New lithium mines require 7 to 12 years to develop from initial discovery to commercial production. This timeline cannot be compressed. Geological surveys, environmental reviews, infrastructure construction, processing facility development, all operate on schedules that do not respond to urgency. Demand that materializes in 2030 requires production capacity that begins development now. And most high-grade deposits capable of economic extraction are already controlled by Canadian companies or subject to Canadian regulatory authority. This creates a window where alternatives cannot emerge fast enough to prevent dependency. Countries that committed to aggressive electrification targets now face the reality that meeting those commitments requires Canadian cooperation. Not as one option among many, as the only option that delivers materials at required scale within required timeframes. The rare earth element situation demonstrates the same pattern with even greater concentration. These 17 elements are essential for virtually every advanced technology. Smartphones require neodymium and dysprosium. Wind turbines need praseodymium and terbium. Military systems depend on samarium and gadolinium. Medical equipment uses europium and yttrium. There are no substitutes, no alternatives, no workarounds. For 3 decades, China dominated rare earth processing, controlling between 70 and 90% of global refining capacity, depending on the specific element. This monopoly was not built on superior geology. China's domestic rare earth deposits are substantial but not unique. The dominance came from strategic investment in processing infrastructure during a period when Western nations treated these materials as commodity products not worth protecting. But processing requires feedstock, and China's domestic rare earth deposits are depleting faster than new sources can be developed. Production from Chinese mines peaked several years ago and has entered structural decline. This creates vulnerability that China cannot address through domestic policy because the geology has been exhausted. Canada possesses rare earth deposits in Saskatchewan, Quebec, and the Northwest Territories that match or exceed the grade and scale of Chinese resources. More importantly, Canada has the processing knowledge, the industrial base, and the political stability required to build refining capacity that can operate for decades without risk of nationalization, supply interruption, or political interference. The Pentagon recognized this dynamic years ago. American defense systems contain thousands of kilograms of rare earth materials per platform. A single F-35 fighter jet requires approximately 400 kilograms. Nuclear submarines need over 4,000. Missile systems, radar installations, satellite networks, all depend entirely on materials that American territory does not contain in exploitable quantities. This is not a theoretical concern. It is an operational constraint that shapes defense planning. When the Department of Defense classifies critical mineral supply chains as essential to national security, that classification reflects analysis concluding that American military capacity could be limited by adversaries controlling these supplies. Specifically, the analysis identified Chinese processing dominance as a strategic vulnerability that could be exploited during conflicts. Canada represents the only alternative that meets American security requirements. Australian rare earth deposits exist, but shipping routes from Australia to American manufacturing centers, transit waters where China could impose interdiction during conflicts. African deposits face governance instability. South American resources lack processing infrastructure. Only Canadian sources combine accessible geology, existing industrial capacity, secure transportation routes, and political reliability. This gives Canada leverage over American defense production that extends beyond commercial relationships. When American contractors cannot source materials from Canadian suppliers, their ability to fulfill defense contracts becomes dependent on Canadian policy decisions. This is not leverage that money can overcome. If Canadian regulatory authorities determine that rare earth exports do not serve Canadian interests, those exports do not occur regardless of prices offered. The American response demonstrated how seriously this dependency is viewed. The Defense Production Act, which traditionally applied only to American domestic industry, was expanded to include critical mineral development in allied nations. This unprecedented step acknowledges that American military capacity now depends on resources located outside American territory and subject to foreign government control. Billions of dollars in loan guarantees, tax incentives, and direct subsidies have been directed toward Canadian critical mineral projects. These are not market transactions. They are strategic investments designed to secure supply chains that American planners consider essential to maintaining global military reach. But funding does not create sovereignty. The resources remain under Canadian jurisdiction, subject to Canadian law, controlled by Canadian policy decisions. Canada has implemented export licensing requirements for critical minerals that give government officials authority to review and potentially restrict sales to specific countries or companies. This regulatory framework creates leverage that cannot be purchased. Access to Canadian critical minerals depends on maintaining relationships that Canada finds acceptable across multiple domains. Trade policy, diplomatic positions, security cooperation all become variables in negotiations that the resource-dependent party cannot avoid. This operates differently than traditional resource diplomacy. Oil-producing nations that attempted to leverage energy exports faced coordinated responses. Consumer nations developed strategic reserves, diversified suppliers, and in some cases pursued military options. Critical minerals do not permit these responses. Strategic reserves are less effective because the materials are consumed in manufacturing rather than burned for energy. Alternative suppliers do not exist at required scale, and military interventions against a NATO member sharing the world's longest undefended border would be strategically incoherent. Instead, the response has been accommodation. Manufacturing companies relocate production facilities to Canada to secure supply chain access. Defense contractors form joint ventures with Canadian partners. Technology firms share intellectual property in exchange for guaranteed mineral allocations. Governments adjust foreign policies to avoid disputes that might jeopardize Canadian cooperation. The pattern is most visible in American-Canadian relations. Trade disputes that might have escalated in previous decades now resolve quickly because American negotiators understand that Canada controls materials American industry cannot function without. When the previous administration imposed steel and aluminum tariffs, Canadian retaliation targeted products from politically sensitive districts, while officials reminded American manufacturers of their critical mineral dependencies. The tariffs were eliminated within months. European dependency is even more acute. The European Union has virtually no domestic critical mineral production at meaningful scale. Every battery manufactured in Europe, every wind turbine, every electric vehicle depends on imported materials. And as Chinese supply chains become less reliable due to geopolitical tensions, European manufacturers are turning to Canada as the only alternative source meeting security and sustainability requirements. Germany has signed bilateral agreements guaranteeing Canadian critical mineral access in exchange for technology transfers. France has committed to building processing facilities in Canada. Italian and Spanish companies are investing in Canadian mining operations at valuations exceeding what commercial analysis would justify. These are not temporary arrangements. They are structural integrations, locking European industrial capacity to Canadian resource decisions for decades. Japan and South Korea face similar constraints. Both operate advanced manufacturing economies dependent entirely on imported critical minerals. Both attempted to diversify away from Chinese sources, but found limited alternatives. Canada offers what these countries need most: distance from Chinese pressure and reliability from a partner that does not leverage supply for political concessions. Japanese investment in Canadian critical mineral projects exceeds all other foreign jurisdictions combined. Korean battery manufacturers have built expansion plans around guaranteed Canadian lithium and cobalt access. Both governments have elevated Canada to top-tier status in resource security strategies. The relationships extend beyond commercial transactions into joint research initiatives, developing next-generation battery technologies optimized for Canadian mineral specifications. This matters because once manufacturing processes are designed around specific material properties, changing sources requires complete redesigns. Technologies developed using Canadian lithium cannot simply substitute material from other deposits without extensive re-engineering. This creates lock-in effects where initial supply relationships become permanent dependencies because the cost of switching exceeds any benefit from alternative sources. China recognizes this pattern. After years assuming processing dominance would remain unchallenged, Chinese officials now acknowledge that Canadian critical mineral supplies represent strategic assets they cannot control through market mechanisms. The response has been attempts to acquire stakes in Canadian mining operations through state-owned enterprises. Canadian regulators have blocked most acquisition attempts on national security grounds. The Investment Canada Act was amended to give government broader authority to review and block foreign investments in critical mineral sectors. Chinese attempts to acquire major lithium and rare earth projects were rejected. Proposed sales of cobalt operations to Chinese state enterprises were blocked, and restrictions were placed on technology transfers that would allow Chinese companies to replicate Canadian processing capabilities. These decisions created diplomatic tensions, but clarified the strategic landscape. Canada will not allow critical mineral advantages to be purchased by countries that might use those advantages against Canadian interests or allies. This position is sustainable because Canada controls the underlying resources. Unlike technology that can be stolen or manufacturing capacity that can be replicated, geological deposits cannot be moved or reproduced. The climate dimension adds urgency to this structural advantage. The global transition to renewable energy requires massive quantities of critical minerals. Wind turbines need rare earth elements for generators. Solar panels require high-purity materials. Energy storage systems need lithium, cobalt, and nickel in quantities exceeding current production by orders of magnitude. And transition timelines are compressed by political commitments most governments have made to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. This timeline is incompatible with development schedules for new mining projects. Commitments to install renewable capacity by 2030 require minerals being extracted now. There's no time to develop alternative sources in jurisdictions currently lacking production infrastructure. Countries that made aggressive climate commitments now face the reality that achieving those goals depends on accessing critical minerals from the limited sources that can increase production quickly. Canada is one of perhaps 3 countries globally that can significantly expand critical mineral production within required timeframes. This gives Canadian policymakers influence over which countries meet climate goals and which face political consequences of failure. It is leverage operating parallel to but independently from commercial relationships. A country that cannot source lithium cannot electrify transportation. A country that cannot access rare earth elements cannot build wind turbines at scale. A country that cannot obtain cobalt cannot store renewable energy. These are not technical problems better engineering can solve. They are material constraints no amount of innovation overcomes without the underlying minerals. Canadian climate policy has been structured to exploit this leverage without stating it explicitly. Export preferences are framed as ensuring Canadian minerals support global emissions reductions rather than being diverted to projects not advancing climate goals. This provides both moral justification and practical mechanism for preferencing buyers aligned with Canadian interests. The infrastructure dimension completes the advantage. Critical mineral deposits in many countries are located where transportation infrastructure does not exist. Getting minerals from remote sites to processing facilities and international markets requires roads, railways, ports, and power systems taking years to build and costing billions to finance. Canada's deposits are located where basic infrastructure exists or can be extended from existing networks. The James Bay region connects to provincial electrical grids and road networks. Processing facilities can be built near existing hydroelectric power sources with direct access to deep-water ports. This infrastructure advantage reduces development costs and accelerates production timelines in ways competitors cannot replicate. In markets where demand grows exponentially, being first captures market share that becomes difficult to displace. Canadian projects coming online in the late 2020s will lock in supply agreements extending through the 2040s. This is not a race where all competitors start from the same position. Canada begins with geological advantages, processing knowledge, political stability, infrastructure access, and established relationships. Competitors must overcome all these disadvantages simultaneously. We are watching resource concentration that has no historical parallel. Oil production distributed across dozens of countries, agricultural production spans continents, but critical minerals are concentrating in a single jurisdiction possessing unique combinations of geology, institutions, and geography. This concentration is not reversible through policy changes or investment decisions. It is locked in by physical realities no amount of capital overcomes. Most countries are not there yet. Their planners still view critical minerals as commodity markets responding to normal supply and demand dynamics. They assume alternatives emerge if prices rise sufficiently. These assumptions work for most commodities. They fail for critical minerals. The geological concentration is too extreme. Development timelines are too extended. Substitution possibilities are too limited. This is where the title reveals its meaning. The fatal resource shift is not Canada's discovery of critical minerals. It is the global economy's transition to technologies requiring materials that exist in exploitable quantities only where Canada holds dominant positions. Each technological advance increased dependency on materials that fewer jurisdictions could supply. Each commitment to electrification locked in demand that only specific sources could meet. Each supply agreement signed made the dependency more permanent. By the time the pattern becomes obvious, the adjustments required extend beyond what most countries can implement. You cannot develop new lithium deposits in 7 years when your electrification commitments require supply in 3. You cannot build rare earth processing capacity when the expertise took decades to develop. You cannot redesign entire technology platforms because preferred material sources are unavailable. The resource shift made Canada unstoppable because the alternatives required time that decisions already made have consumed. The dependencies locked in before most observers recognized they were forming. An economy that cannot produce batteries cannot electrify transportation. An economy that cannot build renewable systems cannot meet climate commitments. An economy that cannot manufacture advanced electronics cannot participate in technology sectors defining the next industrial era. The contraction will be gradual. Manufacturing relocates to jurisdictions with secure material supplies. Employment decreases in sectors dependent on critical mineral access. Tax revenues decline as industrial bases shrink. Political instability emerges as populations demand explanations for declining prosperity. Canada understood this earlier than most, not through superior foresight, but because controlling resources makes leverage obvious in ways depending on resources does not. When you hold materials others need, you see dependency clearly. When you need materials others hold, you find reasons to believe dependency is manageable. Canada spent years building infrastructure, developing partnerships, and establishing regulatory frameworks, converting geological advantages into permanent leverage. Other countries spent those same years assuming situations would resolve through market mechanisms. They will not resolve. They will intensify. As demand grows and alternative sources fail to materialize at required scale, dependency becomes more acute. By the time most countries recognize their vulnerability, adjustments required exceed their capacity to implement quickly. This is not prediction. This is observation of patterns already in motion. Supply agreements are signed, processing facilities are under construction, technology partnerships are operational, the fatal resource shift already occurred. The dependency is already locked into place, the leverage already transferred. What remains is recognition spreading through systems that have not yet acknowledged the new reality. This is how power transfers between nations. Not through conquest or revolution, but through dependencies that establish themselves before anyone notices they have become inescapable.